I never thought a phone call from my mother at midnight would save my life. But as I stood in my bathroom 3 days later, staring at a pink toothbrush that wasn't mine, I realized that sometimes the people who love us see the truth long before we're ready to face it. My name is Andrea Miller, and until that phone call, I believed I had everything figured out. At 32, I was living what looked like a perfect life in our downtown Columbus apartment. My husband Mark was a successful engineer, the kind of man who wore tailored suits and talked about infrastructure projects over dinner parties. Our Instagram feed told a story of romantic date nights, weekend getaways, and the kind of marriage that made other couples envious. But Instagram doesn't show you the empty dinner plates I scraped into the trash at 10 p.m. or the way I'd learned to fall asleep alone, telling myself that his work trips were just part of the sacrifice we made for our comfortable life. The night everything changed started ordinarily enough. Mark had texted earlier that he'd be working late again. Something about a site inspection that ran over. I'd made myself a simple dinner, watched half of a movie I couldn't focus on, and was getting ready for bed when my phone lit up with my mother's name. Evelyn Carter wasn't the type to call after 9 p.m. unless something was seriously wrong. My father's death 5 years ago had made her careful with late-night calls, knowing they carried a weight of worry. Her voice was tight when I answered. There was none of the usual warmth or small talk. She spoke quickly, almost mechanically, as if she'd rehearsed the words. She told me I needed to place a security camera in my living room immediately, position it to capture the front door and main area, and then I needed to leave. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Right now. I remember standing in my bedroom, phone pressed to my ear, feeling my heart start to race. I asked her why. Of course I did, but she refused to explain. She just repeated that I needed to trust her, that I would understand later, and that I absolutely could not stay in my apartment that night. The urgency in her voice was something I'd never heard before. Not even when my father was dying. This was different. This was fear mixed with certainty. And it terrified me. My hands were shaking as I searched through the hall closet for the old security camera we'd bought 2 years ago after a string of break-ins in the building. We'd never actually set it up, and the box was buried under winter coats and forgotten umbrellas. I pulled it out, reading the instructions with growing confusion and panic. Why was I doing this? What was I supposed to see? But I trusted my mother. Despite the absurdity of the situation, despite every logical part of my brain screaming that this was paranoid and crazy, I trusted her. It took me almost an hour to get the camera working properly. I positioned it inside the large potted ficus tree in the corner of our living room, adjusting the angle until I could see the entire space through the app on my phone. The front door. The couch where Mark and I watched movies. The kitchen entrance. All of it was visible. I tested it several times, walking back and forth, watching myself on the screen like an actor in a play I didn't understand. By the time I locked the apartment door behind me, it was almost 11:30. I'd packed a small overnight bag, moving through the rooms in a daze, grabbing my toothbrush and a change of clothes while my mind raced through possibilities. An affair. That's what this had to be about. My mother thought Mark was cheating, and she wanted me to have proof before confronting me. The thought made me feel sick, but I pushed it away. Mark wouldn't do that. He worked hard. Yes. And he was often distant. But that was just stress from his job. Wasn't it? I drove to Chloe's apartment across town. My best friend since college. She opened the door in pajamas, immediately pulling me inside when she saw my face. I told her everything, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to anger to something that looked almost like pity. She said what I was afraid to think. She suggested Mark was having an affair, that my mother had probably seen something, and that the camera would prove it. I defended him instinctively, hearing my own voice rise in pitch as I listed all the reasons why that couldn't be true. He loved me. We'd been together for 8 years, married for 5. He was just busy. He was providing for us. He wouldn't betray me like that. But even as I said the words, I felt them crumbling. How many nights had I eaten dinner alone? How many times had he come home smelling of perfume I'd convinced myself was from a female colleague? How many business trips had taken him away for days at a time, leaving me to water his plants and pay his bills and keep his life running smoothly while he was God knows where? My phone buzzed. It was Mark, asking where I was. I told him I was staying at Chloe's, that I needed some girl time, His response came quickly. Just a simple okay, with no questions. No disappointment. No suggestion that he missed me or wanted me home. That casual indifference hurt more than I wanted to admit. Then my mother called again. Her voice was even more strained this time, and she made me promise something that felt impossible. She told me I could not watch the camera footage tonight. She said I needed to wait until morning, that watching it in real time would damage me in ways I couldn't undo. She made me swear on my father's memory that I would wait. I promised, but I didn't understand. If Mark was bringing someone home, wouldn't it be better to know immediately? Wouldn't waiting just make it worse? I barely slept that night. I lay on Chloe's couch, staring at my phone, the camera app icon glowing on my screen like a forbidden door. Several times I almost opened it. My thumb hovered over the icon, my heart pounding. But each time I heard my mother's voice in my head, desperate and frightened, begging me to wait. So I waited. And those hours of waiting were perhaps the longest of my life. When dawn finally broke, I couldn't stand it anymore. Chloe was still asleep in her bedroom. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build outside. I sat up, took a deep breath, and opened the app. The footage was organized by motion detection, and there was a clip time-stamped at 12:17 a.m. Stan. I pressed play. The video began with the sound of keys in the lock. My heart was already racing. The door opened, and Mark walked in. But he wasn't alone. Behind him was a woman I'd never seen before. Young and beautiful, maybe in her mid-20s, with long dark hair and a confidence in her walk that suggested she'd been here many times before. She set her purse down on the console table, the same table where I kept my own keys, and Mark closed the door behind them. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Not a quick, furtive kiss, but a deep, passionate embrace that spoke of familiarity and desire. I watched my husband, the man I'd promised my life to, kiss this stranger with more passion than he'd shown me in years. My hands went numb. The phone felt like it might slip from my grasp. But I couldn't look away. The woman, I would later learn her name was Tiffany Hayes, walked toward our bedroom, disappearing from the camera's view. Mark poured 2 glasses of wine from the bottle I'd bought last week, the expensive Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion. A few minutes later, Tiffany emerged wearing my pale blue sweater, the soft cashmere one I'd folded carefully just days ago and left on top of my dresser. She wore it like it was hers, settling onto our couch with the ease of someone who belonged there. They talked and laughed. I couldn't hear what they were saying. The camera only recorded video, but I could see their body language. Mark touched her hair with a gentleness I barely remembered. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They looked like a couple. They looked like us. Or rather, like what we used to be before the distance and the late nights and the slow erosion of intimacy that I'd told myself was normal. I watched the entire clip. Then I watched it again. And again. Each viewing revealed new details that cut deeper. The way Tiffany knew where the wine glasses were kept. The way she adjusted the throw pillows on the couch, rearranging them the way she preferred. The way Mark looked at her, really looked at her, with attention and presence that I hadn't received in months. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a relationship. This was a life he'd built in parallel to ours. And he'd built it in our home. In our space. Using our things. I don't remember driving back to the apartment. Chloe insisted on coming with me, and we barely spoke during the 20-minute drive. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. But it felt contaminated now, poisoned by knowledge. I walked straight to the bathroom, Chloe following close behind, and that's when I saw them. A pink toothbrush in the holder next to mine. A bottle of foundation. A brand I didn't use. Sitting on the counter. Mascara. Eyelash curler. A bottle of perfume with a scent I'd smelled before but couldn't place. Sweet and cloying and wrong. They were arranged casually, as if they'd always been there. As if this woman had every right to occupy my bathroom. My home. My life. I opened the medicine cabinet. Her contact lens solution was there. Her prescription bottle with her name printed clearly. Tiffany Hayes. Birth control pills. More makeup. An entire section of the cabinet had been reorganized to accommodate her things, pushed in next to my own toiletries like we were roommates sharing space. That's when I broke. I sat down on the bathroom floor, my back against the cool tile wall, and I sobbed. Not quiet, dignified tears, but gut-wrenching, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep inside me. Chloe sat down next to me, holding me while I cried, and I felt like my entire world was collapsing inward. How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? How many nights had I slept in this apartment while another woman's things accumulated in my bathroom? How many times had Mark come home to me after being with her, kissing me with the same mouth, touching me with the same hands? The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the elaborate lie he'd constructed. It was about the double life he'd been living. The calculated deception of maintaining our marriage while building something else entirely. It was about me, sitting alone night after night, believing his excuses, trusting him completely while he made a fool of me in the most intimate way possible. Later that day, I went to my mother's house. Evelyn was waiting for me, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she knew I'd seen everything. We sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast as a child, and she told me the truth. She'd known for 3 weeks. She'd seen Mark and Tiffany together at a coffee shop downtown, sitting close, holding hands, kissing in public without any concern for who might see them. Evelyn had followed them, watched them walk into our apartment building together, watched them disappear inside. She'd wanted to tell me immediately, but she knew I wouldn't believe her. She knew I'd defend Mark, make excuses, convince myself she was mistaken. So she'd planned this instead, giving me undeniable proof that I couldn't rationalize away. Then she told me something I'd never known. My father had cheated on her, years before he died, carrying on an affair for almost 2 years before she discovered it. She'd stayed, tried to make it work, convinced herself that she could fix it if she just loved him enough, tried hard enough, but the trust never came back. The wound never fully healed. And when he died, part of her felt relief mixed with the grief. Relief that she didn't have to keep pretending anymore. She didn't want that for me. She didn't want me to waste years of my life trying to resurrect something that Mark had killed. She wanted me to know the truth so I could make a choice. A real choice, with full knowledge of what he'd done. I stayed at my mother's house that night. And the next. My mind churning through memories and reevaluating every moment of the past months through this new lens. Things that hadn't made sense now clicked into place with sickening clarity. The weekend trip Mark canceled at the last minute, claiming work issues. The way he'd started showering immediately after coming home. The nights he'd sleep on the couch, saying he didn't want to disturb me with his late arrival. His sudden interest in going to the gym at odd hours. The credit card charges I'd questioned and he'd explained away. Every lie. Every manipulation. Every time, he'd made me feel like I was being paranoid or demanding or unreasonable when I questioned his behavior. It had all been calculated. He'd gaslit me into doubting my own instincts while he carried on this other relationship right under my nose, literally bringing her into our home while I was away. The anger came slowly at first, and then all at once. A hot, burning rage that replaced the grief. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to collapse. I was going to do something. I remembered the trip to Turkey we'd booked months ago. An expensive 2-week vacation that was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, to revitalize our marriage. The flights and hotels were already paid for. Thousands of dollars invested in what I'd hoped would be a new beginning. Mark was looking forward to it. Had mentioned it several times recently, with an enthusiasm he rarely showed for anything related to us anymore. I called Chloe. She answered on the first ring. And I asked her about Jessica Stone, a mutual friend we'd met at a party last year. Jessica was a travel photographer, spontaneous and adventurous. Exactly the kind of person who'd say yes to a last-minute international trip. Chloe gave me her number. Jessica picked up. And I explained the situation. Not everything. Not the whole sordid story. But enough. My husband had cheated. Our marriage was over. And I had a non-refundable trip to Turkey that I wasn't about to waste. Would she want to come with me? I'd cover Mark's portion of the expenses. All she'd need was her own spending money. There was a pause. And then Jessica laughed. A bright, genuine sound that made something loosen in my chest. She said she'd love to. The next 2 days were a blur of phone calls and bureaucracy. I had to navigate the airline's transfer policy, deal with customer service representatives who weren't used to such requests, pay the change fees and penalties. But I was relentless. I provided documentation, sent emails, followed up repeatedly. Chloe and my mother helped, making calls on my behalf, researching policies, supporting my determination to see this through. Finally, it was done. Mark's name was removed from the ticket. Jessica Stone would be my travel companion to Istanbul. The confirmation email arrived like a victory declaration, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Power. Control. The ability to shape my own life rather than simply reacting to Mark's choices. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't warn him or explain or give him any chance to argue or manipulate the situation. I simply showed up at the airport on departure day with Jessica by my side. We arrived early, checking our bags and getting our boarding passes. I was calm in a way that surprised me. My hands steady. My voice even. Jessica could sense the tension but respected my silence, offering her presence without demanding conversation. We stood near the security checkpoint, waiting. And I knew Mark would arrive soon. He was always punctual for flights. He appeared 20 minutes before boarding, walking quickly, his carry-on bag over his shoulder, a coffee in his hand. He was smiling, probably relieved to be getting away, to have 2 weeks of vacation. Then he saw me, and he saw Jessica, and the smile died on his face. He walked over slowly, confusion and anger warring in his expression. He stopped a few feet away, staring at Jessica like he couldn't quite process her presence. Then he turned to me, and I watched him struggle to control his voice in the public space. He asked what was happening. He demanded to know why Jessica was there. He said this was our trip, our marriage trip, and that I couldn't just bring someone else along without discussing it. I kept my voice low and steady, conscious of the people around us. I told him he wasn't going to Turkey. His ticket had been transferred. He wouldn't be joining me on this trip or any other trip. This was the end of us, and he'd have to find his own way home from the airport. His face went red. He moved closer, lowering his voice to an angry hiss. He called me crazy. He said I couldn't do this, that the trip was for both of us, that it was already paid for with our joint account. He tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back, and Jessica moved slightly in front of me, her expression hard. I told him that he'd given up his rights to our joint anything when he brought Tiffany Hayes into our home. I said her name clearly, watching it land like a slap. He went pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He tried to recover, started to claim it was a misunderstanding, but I cut him off. I asked him about the pink toothbrush, about the perfume and the makeup and the prescription bottle with her name on it, about my sweater that she'd worn, curled up on our couch while he touched her the way he used to touch me. I asked him how long he'd been making a fool of me, how many times he'd lied to my face, how many nights he'd slept next to me after being with her. People were starting to stare now, drawn by the intensity of our conversation, even though we were keeping our voices down. Mark looked around frantically, aware of the audience, his professional reputation and social image crumbling in real time. He tried again to lower his voice, to pull me aside, to have this conversation privately, but I refused to move. I told him it was over. I told him I'd already contacted a lawyer. I told him the camera footage and photographic evidence of her belongings in our home would be more than enough to ensure he got nothing from me in the divorce. Then I wished him a good life, turned away, and walked towards security with Jessica. Behind me, I heard him call my name, but I didn't turn around. I felt Jessica's hands squeeze my arm in support as we joined the security line. I didn't look back to see if he was still standing there. I didn't care. On the plane, as we lifted off and Columbus disappeared below us, I felt something shift inside me. Fear. Yes, about what came next. About rebuilding my life alone, but also relief. And underneath it all, a small flame of something that felt almost like joy. I was free. For the first time in years, I was making choices for myself, answering to no one, responsible only for my own happiness. Istanbul was beautiful. The call to prayer echoing across the city at dawn. The spice markets with their riot of colors and scents. The ancient architecture and the Bosphorus glittering in the sun. Jessica was the perfect travel companion, knowing when I wanted to talk and when I needed silence. Happy to explore or simply sit in cafes watching the world go by. I started posting on social media, sharing photos of the trip, but not the glossy, filtered images I used to post with Mark. These were real. Me smiling genuinely. Hair messy from the wind. No makeup. Just experiencing life. I wrote captions about new beginnings, about finding yourself after loss, about the strength it takes to walk away from something broken. The posts got attention. Friends reached out. Some surprised. Some saying they'd suspected something was wrong. Many offering support. I also got messages from women I barely knew, thanking me for sharing my story, telling me about their own situations, their own decisions to stay or leave or fight for themselves. It was humbling and empowering at once. One evening, sitting at an outdoor restaurant overlooking the water, I told Jessica about my dreams. I'd always wanted to write, to travel and document experiences, to create something meaningful beyond the Instagram facade I'd been maintaining. I wanted to start a blog about real life, about resilience, about rebuilding after betrayal. I wanted to help other women see that they didn't have to accept less than they deserved. Jessica encouraged me immediately. She offered to teach me about photography, to help me build a platform, to collaborate on content. We stayed up late that night planning, dreaming, imagining a future that felt exciting rather than suffocating. When we returned to Columbus 2 weeks later, I didn't go back to the apartment. I stayed with my mother while my lawyer handled the divorce proceedings. Mark tried to contact me repeatedly, texts and calls and emails that swung between apologetic and angry. But I blocked his number after the first few attempts. I had nothing to say to him that my lawyer couldn't communicate more effectively. The divorce was ugly. Mark fought harder than I expected, trying to claim the affair was my fault somehow, that I'd driven him to it with my emotional distance and demands. His lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, using the Turkey trip as evidence of my erratic behavior. But my lawyer was better. She presented the camera footage in court. A clip of Mark and Tiffany in our home, undeniable and damning. She showed photos of Tiffany's belongings in our bathroom, the receipts for dinners and hotels Mark had charged to our joint credit card. She laid out a pattern of calculated deception and financial infidelity that left Mark's arguments in ruins. The judge was not sympathetic to Mark. I was awarded the apartment, which I immediately sold, and the majority of our joint assets. Mark was ordered to pay a substantial settlement for the emotional distress and financial damages his deception had caused. It wasn't about the money for me. It was about acknowledgement, about a system recognizing the harm he'd done and holding him accountable. Mark's life unraveled quickly after that. Word spread through his professional network about the affair and the divorce. His reputation, which he'd valued so highly, was destroyed. Several colleagues distanced themselves from him. He lost a major project he'd been heading, his company quietly reassigning him to a less visible role. Last I heard from mutual acquaintances, he and Tiffany had broken up, unable to sustain their relationship once it was dragged into the light and stripped of its forbidden excitement. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. I didn't celebrate his losses. I simply moved forward with my own life, focused on building something new. I sold the apartment for more than we'd paid for it, and used the money to fund my new venture. I started the blog I'd dreamed about, documenting not just travel, but the emotional journey of starting over. I wrote about setting boundaries, recognizing red flags, understanding your own worth. I shared resources about therapy and healing and legal rights. I interviewed other women who'd been through similar experiences, giving them a platform to tell their stories. The blog grew faster than I expected. Within 6 months, I had thousands of regular readers. Brands started reaching out for partnerships. I was invited to speak at events about resilience and self-advocacy. I traveled frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jessica or other friends I'd met through the blog community, each trip expanding my perspective and feeding my writing. My relationship with my mother deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Understanding what she'd been through with my father, seeing her strength in leading that situation and rebuilding her life as a single mother, gave me a new appreciation for her. We talked more openly than we ever had, sharing our experiences, supporting each other's growth. She told me she was proud of me, not just for leaving Mark, but for transforming my pain into something that helped others. I went to therapy, working through the betrayal and the grief and the anger. I learned about trauma responses and attachment patterns and the ways we sometimes choose partners who confirm our deepest fears about ourselves. I discovered that my need to be perfect, to maintain that Instagram-worthy marriage, had come from a place of insecurity, a belief that I had to earn love through performance. Mark's betrayal, as painful as it was, had shattered that illusion and forced me to find a more authentic way of living. I dated casually, nothing serious, learning what I wanted and didn't want in a partner. I learned to recognize manipulation tactics early, to trust my instincts, to walk away at the first sign of disrespect. I learned that being alone was better than being with someone who made me feel lonely. A year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Mark at a coffee shop downtown. It was awkward and brief. He looked older, tired, diminished somehow. He asked how I was, and I told him honestly that I was doing well. He said he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he hoped I could forgive him someday. I told him forgiveness was a process I was working on, but it was for my own peace, not for his absolution. Then I wished him well and left. I meant it. I did wish him well, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger and bitterness would only poison my own life. He'd taken enough from me. I wasn't going to give him any more of my energy or emotional space. Now, 2 years after that midnight phone call from my mother, I'm sitting in a cafe in Prague, working on an article about the importance of trusting your instincts. My blog has evolved into a full platform with a podcast, courses on emotional wellness, and a community of thousands of women supporting each other. I published a book last month about my experience and the lessons I learned, and it's already on several bestseller lists. I bought a small house in Columbus, decorated exactly how I want it, filled with plants and books and art from my travels. I have a cat named Istanbul who sleeps on my desk while I write. I have friends who I see regularly, not because I'm trying to maintain appearances, but because I genuinely enjoy their company. I have hobbies and interests that have nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I have a life that belongs entirely to me, shaped by my choices, aligned with my values, rich with meaning and purpose. Sometimes people ask me if I regret marrying Mark, if I wish I could have back those years I spent with him. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain. Certainly. I regret not trusting my instincts sooner, not valuing myself enough to demand better treatment. But I don't regret the journey that brought me here, to this version of myself that I genuinely like and respect. That midnight phone call didn't save my marriage. It saved me. It forced me to see a truth I'd been avoiding, to make a choice I'd been too afraid to make, to step into uncertainty rather than remain in a comfortable lie. My mother's courage in giving me that gift, even knowing it would hurt me, was an act of profound love. The silent ritual Mark and Tiffany performed in my home, the secret life they built while I waited faithfully, was meant to make a fool of me. Instead, it freed me. Their betrayal became my catalyst. Their deception, the push I needed to discover my own strength. I'm not grateful for what Mark did, but I'm grateful for who I became because of it. I'm grateful for the woman who sits in this Prague cafe, confident and clear-eyed, building a life of purpose and meaning. I'm grateful for the community I've created, for the women I've helped, for the stories I've shared and the connections I've made. And I'm grateful for that midnight phone call, for my mother's insistence that I see the truth, for the camera that captured evidence I couldn't deny, for every painful step of the journey that brought me here. Because here, finally, I am home, not in a place, but in myself. And that is worth more than any perfect-looking marriage, any Instagram-worthy life, any comfortable lie could ever be.